Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. So in my video that I just uploaded late last night regarding the Maryamites, I called it the Maryamite Show, I said in that video that I wasn't going to make a video about the subject of the Quran discussing the Trinity, and does the Quran accurately represent the Trinity. And we've had a lot of discussion. The discussion continues to go on amongst the comment sections of those videos. So what I did after I uploaded that video, today I started to re-watch the debate between James White and Bassam Zawidi. Since I mentioned the debate in my last video, I thought that I should go back and watch it. Now what I did as I was watching the video, I noticed that there were several, let me rephrase. I didn't just notice this, but a thought crossed my mind that Bassam and James White mentioned several verses from the Quran in their discussion and in their debate. And what I realized I had not done, with the exception of a few verses, was to actually go and look at the tafsirs on the verses that are mentioned by not just James White, but also Bassam as well. And so what I did is I looked up the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir for chapter 5, verse 73. And found some very fascinating things that I was not aware of, that what the Tafsir says. Now, before I get to the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, I want to discuss something that I mentioned in my video that I just did, the Maryamite Show. I wanted to mention something again that I'd said in that video, because in watching the debate between James White and Bassam Zawidi again, I see that what I said in my previous video is still accurate. That their debate really rests on, and James White actually mentions this himself in the debate, that it rests on interpreting the Quran. How are we to interpret the Quran? If we are simply to isolate each verse and not look at a theme that goes on throughout the Quran, as Bassam seems to be saying, as well as a lot of the users who are commenting on my videos, that we can't jump from chapter to chapter, we can't look for a consistent theme, we have to look at each verse on their own, or do we do what James White does and look for a consistent theme that occurs in the Quran? Which one is accurate? Which one should we do? What I find is that many scholars do what James White is doing, which is they look for a consistent theme in the text. They are not just isolating each verse and not looking for a consistent context. Now, Bassam does think about, and he does mention, certain scholars that are talking about the Trinity, and they're talking about their commentary on the Quran. Now, I mention this because I don't want to jump into Ibn Kathir quite yet, but if you're interested, I will put in the more info section of this video, I will put the link to the debate between James White and Bassam Zawidi, if you haven't seen it. I'm actually referring to the first link, which would be part 1 of the debate, uploaded by James White's channel. I'm looking at minute 46 to about, minute 50. Where Bassam begins to talk about commentators that accurately represented the Christian faith, the Trinity, in the context of commenting on the Quran. So in other words, these are Quranic commentators. They have done tafsirs, and they are talking about the Trinity as one being expressed in 3 persons. There's no mention of Mary at all. So Bassam says that, look, these guys got it right. And he lists a number of names. Then he actually goes so far as to say that it's actually that one scholar said it was a minority view to say that Mary is a part of the Trinity. This is what he quotes. I think it was Tabarani that he quotes in saying this. But then a little down the road, as the minutes are going by, he starts to just list off Muslim scholars that, just from what I can tell, are just accurately writing about the Trinity. Okay? it's not in the context of saying that they were Quranic commentators, but simply that they understood the Trinity correctly. Now, the question that I have is I have tried to look for these individuals, their names. I've actually tried to Google, Muslim scholars who have understood the Trinity, and I find a lot of articles that are apologetic and polemic in nature. I guess I'll have to go through each one of the scholars Bassam mentions individually and see if I can find their work, if they're even in English. So this is actually a question I have for all of you. If anyone out there has links to tafsirs that are done by the scholars mentioned by Bassam in the minute 46 to about minute 50, it could even be between minute 40 to 50. It's somewhere around there within that 10-minute period where he starts listing off these names. If anybody has access to English translations, I would be very interested in that. Having said that, even if someone were to present to me the works of these scholars he mentions in English so that I can understand it, I'm willing to accept that there were commentators of the Quran, he mentions a few, that were in the context that they were commentators, they were doing tafsir on the Quran, and they understood the Trinity in this way. I'm willing to accept Bassam's statement of that, because I've never wanted to say that no Muslim has accurately represented Islam ever. I know that that's not correct. But I'm also interested because at some point he then starts talking about Muslim scholars who understood the Trinity accurately, at least from what he says they say. I'd like to actually read this material for myself, which is why I'm asking people to provide it for me. Please. But then he starts quoting scholars or alluding to scholars that understood the Trinity, but he doesn't say that all of these other scholars were commentators on the Quran. So what I mean by that is, are they actually saying that all of these verses in the Quran are accurately representing the Trinity and Christian belief? That is actually something that Bassam, in my opinion, is not clear about in the debate. He's clear that there have been Muslims who have clearly understood the Trinity, and yet, based on what though? Based on their interaction with Christians? Based on what? How did they understand? How did we know they understood the Trinity? As I mentioned in my previous video, it's not just Ibn Kathir's tafsir. It's the fact that he is quoting other scholars besides himself who were narrators of traditions that had to do with Christian belief and history. So, I don't know whether it's really right to just stack up, I have all these names, and I can come back and say, I have all these names of Muslims who apparently did not understand Christian history, or ignorant, or had misinformation about Christian history and belief. So I do, in retrospect, looking at the debate again, I do appreciate Bassam Zawidi's willingness to list a number of commentators and scholars. I want to make sure I'm clear about the differentiation here. I realize that they're all scholars, but he makes a distinction, Quranic commentators, but then he also at one point just starts listing off names without saying that they were commentators by just saying, they understood the Trinity. I mean, I could say that, and I have his book right here. Ibn Taymiyyah, I could say that, Ibn Taymiyyah may have understood the Trinity. Maybe he did. But does he authentically represent it as Christians understand it? I have said in a future video, I will probably assess Ibn Taymiyyah's book, whether he understands Christianity or not. Whereas Ibn Arabi, as I've mentioned many times before, I'm sure people are sick of this, Ibn Arabi mentions the Trinity too, but he actually says that there's nothing wrong with the Trinity, from what I can tell from the quotations that I have from him in the article I provided, excuse me. So, again, it's a real question of, do all these scholars that Bassam quotes in the debate, were they all linking the Quranic verses to their understanding of the Trinity? Or did they just understand the Trinity and didn't discuss the Quranic verses? Because, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah does not always quote the Quran when he is trying to understand the Christian view of the Trinity. Similarly, Ibn Arabi does not quote the Quran when he is talking about the Trinity. So I pointed that out in a previous video, and I do think that's fascinating that you have the commentators that we have access to very readily here. For example, or excuse me, not bad grammar. Regularly, we have access to their tafsir with the click of a button. Seem to have a misunderstanding of the Trinity, and yet it would appear that there were certain scholars that, perhaps with their discussion of Christians, could just say, well, this is what Christians believe, but didn't link it to the text. So that is a major question. Do all of the commentators, do the scholars, the non-categorized commentators that Bassam mentions in this debate, do all of them link their view of the Trinity to an interpretation of the Quran? Or are they like Ibn Arabi, and to some extent Ibn Taymiyyah, who's not sitting there quoting Quranic verse after Quranic verse and then commenting on the Quranic verse and including their understanding of the Trinity? Or is there a differentiation? Now, going back to the main crux of this video here, this is something that I found very fascinating. Because again, Bassam is saying, at one point in the debate, he also said, well, he's not, the verses are ambiguous, especially 573 is ambiguous in that it doesn't straight out say this is the sect of Christians that are being referred to here. And when I look at the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, this is the right after he quotes Surah 573. He says the disbelief of the Christians, Isa only called to Tawheed, and I'll link this in the more info section. Ibn Kathir says Allah states that the Christians, such sects as Manacherite, Jacobite, and Nestorite, are disbelievers. Those among them who say that Isa is Allah. Allah is far holier than what they attribute to him. They made this claim in spite of the fact that Isa made it known that he was the servant of Allah and his messenger. The first words that Isa uttered when he was still a baby in the cradle were, I am Abdullah, the servant of Allah. He did not say, I am Allah, or I am the son of Allah. Rather, he said, quote, verily, I am a servant of Allah. He has given me the scripture and made me a prophet. Until he said, and verily Allah is my Lord and your Lord, so worship him alone. That is the straight path. He also proclaims to them, when he was a man, after he was sent as a prophet, commanding them to worship the Lord and their Lord alone without partners, quote, but the Messiah said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. Verily, whoever sets up partners with Allah in worship, then Allah has forbidden paradise for them, and the fire will be his abode. As he will send him to the fire and forbid paradise for him, Allah also said, quote, verily Allah forgives not the partners should be set up with him in worship, but he forgives except that anything else to whom he wills, end quote. And the dwellers of the fire will be called to the dwellers of paradise, pour us some water or anything that Allah has provided with you. They will say Allah has forbidden both to the disbelievers. It is recorded in the Sahih that the Prophet had someone proclaim to the people, quote, only a Muslim soul shall enter paradise. In another narration, only a believing soul. That is why Allah said that Isa said to the children of Israel, quote, verily whoever sets up partners with Allah, then Allah has forbidden paradise for him, and the fire will be his abode, and there are no helpers for the wrongdoers. There is no help from Allah, nor anyone who will support or protect them from the state they will be in. Allah's statement, okay, we'll pause there for a moment. One thing I find very interesting, this is something that I've seen consistently throughout the commentators that I have access to, whether it's Ibn Ishaq or, I should say the historians, like Ibn Ishaq, or even the Quranic commentators such as Al-Jalalain, Ibn Kathir, and others, along with Ibn Taymiyyah as well, because I just checked this, rarely, and I have not seen it actually, with the exception of Ibn Ishaq, who comes sort of close. We cannot, as I said in a previous video about called Ibn Ishaq and the Three, we cannot actually corroborate what Ibn Ishaq says in the tradition, or what he records in a tradition about the Christians who came to talk to the Prophet Muhammad. All of the sects that are always mentioned are like Jacobite and the Nestorite. No one ever mentions the Trinitarian orthodoxy. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah, and again I will analyze this book in a future video, does talk about orthodox belief. Certainly he does, and I'll talk about that in the future. But I find it fascinating that the orthodox Christian groups such as the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholics are absent from the discussion of classical Islamic scholars. They keep harping about the Monacharites, the Jacobites, and the Nestorites. And for someone like myself who's trying to look at this as objectively as possible, it almost gives the impression that the Islamic scholars had a real issue with these non-Orthodox groups and not so much with the actual Orthodox group, because you do not have a scholar say the Roman Catholics or the Eastern Orthodox or the Byzantines. Again, Ibn Ishaq's really specific in the tradition when he says the Byzantine Christians are from Najran, that they are of the Byzantine rite, even though, again, as I mentioned in that video, I analyzed that tradition and found that the tradition is in error. Now, I just wanted to put that out there, that here Ibn Kathir again is saying that Allah is saying that the sects, such as the Monacharites, the Jacobites, and the Nestorites, are disbelievers. He does not say the Roman Catholics or the Eastern Orthodox, the Byzantines. He is not actually saying that. And I find that very fascinating that unlike Bassam Sawidi and others who are just saying, oh, the verses are ambiguous, they could be talking about anyone. And yet Ibn Kathir here, and he's not quoting other scholars, so I'm willing to say this is Ibn Kathir's opinion, but again, other scholars, as I've mentioned, have also said this. They are talking about specific sects, such as the Monacharites, the Jacobites, and the Nestorites. And I, again, find that very interesting. Again, I think it's really interesting also that he says that these Christians say this, but then he quotes the Quran to say, no, but Jesus really said this. Well, again, if you're looking at it from the Christian point of view, they do not accept the statements made by the Quran that Jesus apparently said. Again, if you're going to accurately refute someone else's position, you have to prove it from their scripture. But this is not the main point of this video. This is something that came to my mind when I was reading his tafsir. Now let's get to the major quotation here. He then says, Allah's statement, quote, surely they have disbelieved who say Allah is the third of three, end quote. Okay. And then Ibn Kathir says, Mujahid and several others said that this verse, this ayah, was revealed about the Christians in particular. As-Suddi and others said that this ayah, this verse, was revealed about taking Isa, meaning Jesus, and his mother as gods besides Allah, thus making Allah the third in a Trinity. As-Suddi said, quote, this is similar to Allah's statement towards the end of the surah, quote, and remember when Allah will say, O Isa, son of Maryam, did you say unto men, worship me and my mother as two gods besides Allah? He will say, glory be to you. Surah 5, 116. End quote. And then Allah replies, but there is no God but one God, meaning there are not many worthy of worship, but there is only one God without partners, and he is the Lord of all creation and all that exists. I mean, that is fascinating to me because, again, what Ibn Kathir is doing and what he quotes the scholars Mujahid and As-Suddi and says that they're not the only ones who think this, that this verse is saying that not only are they linking this verse to chapter 5, 116 about Mary and Jesus not be, Allah will say to Jesus, did you tell your followers to worship you and your mother as gods besides Allah? They're also saying that this is the Trinity. This is actually the Trinity. That it's Isa and Maryam are the other two members of the Trinity. That this is what Allah, they who disbelieve Allah is the third in three, is saying this. Now again, if this is actually referring to the Monacharites, the Jacobites, and the Nestorites, you would have to then prove that those groups, or any group, actually believe that. Now, not only are there internal issues now, and historical issues, and theological issues, because again, you have to demonstrate historically now that these three sects that Ibn Kathir mentions at the beginning of this page actually believe the Trinity consisted of these three persons, Father, Son, and Mother. But also, I was curious, who is Mujahid and As-Suddi? Now, I'll put in the more info section the articles that I found. There's not a lot, to be honest. And I'm willing to have someone come forth and tell me, no. Ibn Kathir is not actually talking about these two particular people. I'm willing to say that there are more than one mujahids and more than one asudis. That would be two scholars that Ibn Kathir would name drop in the context of saying Mujahid and Asudi and several others thought that the Trinity, that this verse is in the other verses in the Quran are referring to the Trinity consisting of these people. I'm willing to concede to the point, if someone wants to present evidence, that the Mujahid and the Asudi that I'm about to imply are the two individuals Ibn Kathir is quoting and name dropping, that I'm incorrect. I'm willing to concede this if someone wants to bring forth evidence. When I simply Googled Mujahid Islamic scholar, or even a variant, Mujahid Quranic commentator, this is who I found. Mujahid ibn Jabir. Mujahid ibn Jabir was a member of the generation right after the Companions generation. And that, according to this article, which I'll put in the more info section, he was one of the leading Quranic commentators of the generation after that of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. He is the first to compile a written exegesis of the Quran. So he is the first to do this. He is said to have studied under Ali, the fourth caliph, until his martyrdom. At that point, after Ali is martyred, he began to study under Ibn Abbas, a companion of the Prophet known as the father of the Quranic exegesis. Mujahid ibn Jabir was known to be willing to go to great lengths to discover the true meaning of a verse in the Quran. It was considered to be a well-traveled man. Now, I do admit this is from Wikipedia. However, it is referenced by other articles. There are references to these statements about his biography and about who he is, or who he was, excuse me. He's been classed as a very reliable hadith narrator. Another person, Al-Amash, said Mujahid was like someone who carried a treasure. Whenever he spoke, pearls came out of his mouth. And Al-Darabi said the Ummah is unanimous on Mujahid being an imam who is worthy, and I believe it's I don't know if it's meant to say it's jihad, but intijaj. So, and the Shia also have a very positive view of him. Now, what's interesting, I want to now go over. It was harder to find an article about Asudi. I found information about him on another website, which I will link in this video as well, which names him as Ismail bin Abdurrahman. And it says he was born in Kufa and was probably known as Suddi. He learned the Quran from Anas ibn Malik and Ibn Abbas. There are two commentators with the nickname Suddi. Abdurrahman is known as Al-Suddi Kabir, the great Suddi, and his grandson became known as Suddi Jr. Okay, that's the only biographical information that I could really find on someone named As-Suddi in the context of Googling, Quranic commentator or Quranic or Muslim scholar with that name. Now, as I'm recording this video, I've just put into Google his actual name, Ismail Abdul Rahman, to try and find an article if there is any. And since I don't want to waste recording time, I can't find a link or a name to this particular individual. But I found success with finding someone named under a search for As-Suddi, but not Ismail Abdurrahman. So, when I looked at the biographies of these two individuals on these two websites, which I will provide for you, I found a common link. The common link is that they both studied, Mujahid first studied with Ali and then with Ibn Abbas. As-Suddi studied with Anas ibn Malik and Ibn Abbas. So the common link is that they both studied with Ibn Abbas. And I was, of course, reminded of the hadith from Bukhari, which is narrated by Ibn Abbas. Because who was Ibn Abbas, right? We know he was the cousin of the Prophet. And I remembered this hadith. The hadith that says, this is narrated by Ibn Abbas. Once the Prophet embraced me and said, "Oh Allah, bestow on him the knowledge of the book," meaning the Quran. Now, why is this important? Well, I'll explain my train of reasoning here. And again, I'm willing to have someone say, no, these are not the two individuals Ibn Kathir is mentioning. But Ibn Kathir is saying in his Tafsir, regarding Surah 573, they do blaspheme, who say Allah is a third of three, that the commentary for that, the meaning of that verse is that the Trinity consists of Father, Mother, and Son. Allah, Mary, and Jesus. And that he actually quotes is now alluding to and quoting two scholars, one, Mujahid and As-Sudi, that they hold this view amongst several others, according to Ibn Kathir. And it's important because if the Mujahid and the As-Sudi mentioned by Ibn Kathir in his Tafsir are indeed the Mujahid ibn Jabbar and As-Sudi the great Sudi, then these are both students of Ibn Abbas. And if Ibn Abbas is indeed their teacher, Ibn Abbas is credited as being the father of Quranic exegesis and meaning. This is important because, and according to this hadith from Bukhari, the Prophet Muhammad is quoted as saying, "O Allah, bestow on him the knowledge of the book." I think we can all see why this is slightly problematic. In all of my research that I have done thus far, this is a direct link for a particular meaning, a chain of authority on an exegesis of the Quran that goes all the way back to a prayer that the Prophet Muhammad he prays to Allah to bestow this knowledge. He prays to Allah that Allah will bestow this knowledge onto Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas is now a teacher of these two great scholars who are quoted in Ibn Kathir's Tafsir as saying that this is what this verse means, and that the doctrine of the Trinity consists of Father, Mother, and Son. I think we can all see why this is problematic. That this chain of authority of Quranic exegesis, and yet if this is in error, then you can see the logic of where I'm going with this. This is incredibly problematic, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is incredibly problematic. Now, again, the only way that someone can fix this issue is to tell me and provide meaningful evidence that the Mujahid and the As-Sudi that Ibn Kathir mentions in his Tafsir, and I'll provide all the links, is not the two students of Ibn Abbas. And that he's mentioning some other famous exegete scholar, Mujahid and As-Sudi, which I would love to see evidence for that. Until then, based on my research that I have done, I tried to find any alternative. I could not find any alternative than the identity of these two individuals being the students of Ibn Abbas. That Mujahid is the first person to be credited with first writing down an exegesis on a tafsir of the Quran. So this is the earliest tafsir writer we have. So again, Bassam in the debate was saying, oh, well, he was quoting several scholars throughout the different centuries. Well, this person thought the Trinity was this. Well, this is the first written tafsir by Mujahid ibn Jabbar, and if he is indeed the Mujahid mentioned by Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, that's incredibly problematic. For all the reasons I've alluded to. Whether because it's the first tafsir that's written, and because his teacher is Ibn Abbas, the person who is considered to be the father of the exegesis of the Quran. So, again, I'm putting this out here because I would love for people to supply me with a response to But if no one can, then this is incredibly problematic with understanding not only this verse, but also how the earliest Muslims understood what the Quran was saying and their view of the text of the Quran. And if the Quran is accurately talking about Christian belief. And if it's not, this is incredibly problematic in this particular context. So, I mean it, unless someone actually brings up some meaningful, video response or sends me an excellent article that shows that no, Ibn Kathir is not directly quoting Mujahid ibn Jabbar and As-Sudi, that it's some other two people. If someone can provide that, then this will actually be my last video on the subject, because I think unless someone can provide that alternative evidence, this should end it. I mean, this is the end of the discussion here, from what I can tell, based on this chain of authority of exegesis. So thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.